Good evening. Well, first of all, I wanna thank Francesca and Daniela and Vince and Mia and everyone from TBA for having us here, which is really wonderful, and but also poses a great problem for me since ever since I arrived yesterday, I've been buried in information and really interesting ideas. This is a very luxurious problem, of course, and it's a very good problem to have, and it's somehow also connected to what I'm going to speak about, which is what happens in moments of explosive increase in knowledge and ideas. But also we're here to speak about the future, since it's the 10th birthday of TBA, and happy birthday, by the way. And well, I think the future, if you look at the history of human knowledge production, has sort of always been the very central point, of interest, ever since humans started to preoccupy themselves with abstract knowledge. It starts with divination in ancient ages, and it goes towards prognosis, and then in the 17th century someone invents calculus and makes predictions more possible, and now we live in the age of computer simulation, which is very important for oceanographers as well as for meteorologists and everything. So, to make it short, what I'm trying to do is to be monastic in terms of content, because we are here and we have the content of a monastery, and also monadic in terms of context, in which I'm trying to mirror everything that I've heard here so far. My starting point is the year 1600, which is a point in history where a huge, massive explosion in world history and the history of knowledge took place, mainly the first intellectual exchange between China and Europe. So basically the story is this. 5 guys from Italy go via India to China and arrive in Macau, and it takes them another 18 years to actually arrive in Beijing, only to learn that the emperor is not at all interested in Christianity. So inevitably they sit down and they think, what are we going to do? They had the advantage that none of them were actually trained priests. They had been made priests just on the boat on the way there, but all of them were trained scientists, Renaissance scientists. So they had all studied astronomy, mathematics, physics, and philosophy. So they said, okay, what if we can offer something different? We can offer Renaissance science. We can offer, you know, precise formal mathematics. We can offer mechanics. We can offer clocks. And we can offer instruments for astronomy. So this is the reason why the first book that was translated into Chinese, well, the first sort of culturally significant book that was translated into Chinese was not the Bible, but it was Euclid's Elements, which I always found very fascinating. So as we can see, and this is something that I think can also be applied to the situation we have here and to the way that TBA works in general, is back then still there were just 5 people. So it was a small cell, it was a factory, it was a very mobile unit of knowledge production that was working in a very flexible way. And the question that starts to rise, of course, is, because then I can tell you a lot about this history and how it then developed and grew on to become a very big sort of undertaking of international knowledge production. But the thing that interests me more is not what came from Europe to China, because what actually came back here and how that influenced Western thinking. Because transmission, of course, always works both ways, even though we Westerners have the tendency to forget that. Of course, what happens when you translate Western books, especially books about mathematics, into Chinese, is you have to come up with a completely different and a completely unique and new way of formulating knowledge, because we have an alphabet, they don't. They have a writing system that is actually the complete opposite of what we have here. It's incomplete. It's infinite, and you can always add more characters, you can take some characters away. We have a writing system that is discrete. It's a set of symbols which we can use and permutate, and we can create a lot of different things from that. So this is why the first thing that I also wrote in my abstract is that what I find a very central point to translation processes and the importance of translation for the production of knowledge is the incompleteness and the misunderstanding. When the first information about China started to reach Europe, Europe was baffled. Of course, it took years for this information to arrive, and the information was very sparse. There was only very little information, and lots of it was misinformation. Lots of it was politically charged, for example, because the Jesuits in China, of course, could only say this much, not to anger the Vatican. But nevertheless, in Europe, it sparked great controversy, it sparked a lot of discussion, and it raised the question whether it would be possible to have such a writing system as the Chinese, because it seemed the Chinese, and this is actually the case, had a writing system which made it possible for such a big nation of many different spoken languages to have a unified writing system, a unified system of thought, an alphabet of thought. And this is something that interested Europe in the era where formal mathematics first came into play a lot, of course, because it seemed like you could have a system that would actually, which would enable you to invent something, to create new meaning in a very simple way. And one of the people who preoccupied himself most with that was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he was in a decade-long contact with a lot of Jesuit priests in China, and he tried to invent such a writing system. But of course, as we know, there still is no such system. And so Leibniz failed. It had to sort of remain incomplete. But of course, what Leibniz, for example, did invent was binary numbers, and did this, as we know, as the basis of digital computing, is something that he only did because he got a letter from a Jesuit missionary in China saying, we have characters here, the characters that you might all know from the I Ching, that form a binary sequence. And he said, hey, that's interesting, maybe we can introduce that into Europe. The other thing that happened in the 17th century, and was also, I think, very relevant to lots of topics we discussed today, is that in Europe, not only in Europe, but actually in the West, let's say in the West, new institutions came into play. It was the founding period of academias. You had academias in St. Petersburg, in London, Paris, Berlin, and there would have also been one in Beijing hadn't the Christian leaders in Europe decided that they really did have a problem with them not adopting Christianity. So this was a sort of immense setback, we could say. What happens after 1700 and Leibniz dies is that this sort of universalistic approach to knowledge, that of academies, that of that sort of all-encompassing thought of having one unified system with which you could do everything, dies and gives birth to the Enlightenment. And it's always has been my feeling that it had to die, that it has sort of reached critical mass and had become sort of blurry and maybe too baroque, if you will. And so the 18th century and the early 19th century are periods of specialization. The different disciplines in science and the arts sort of get fragmented and become highly specialized, highly powerful disciplines. The Wunderkammer is split up into the museum and the encyclopedia, and well, you might think about, you can think what you will about Enlightenment art. So then at the end of the 19th century, after Enlightenment, again there's sort of the desire for completeness. Everything has been too fragmented for too long. And so there's a bunch of mathematicians who get together at the end of the 19th century, the first of them being Georg Cantor, who did such wonderful things as inventing a way by which you could count to infinity. It's like this guy who just comes around and says, hey, let's count to infinity. I should find a way to do that. And then there's this other guy called David Hilbert, and at 1900 he does a big conference in Paris, and he says, we have to find a way with which we can prove mathematics for its consistency and completeness. So this is very interesting for mathematicians, of course, but it's also interesting as sort of an episode in the history of knowledge itself, because it's just a, you know, that I'm speaking about mathematics is just because it's a very essential point in it. But I think it's an expression of a very overall climate that could be felt around 1900. Also, if you look at the socio-cultural or socio-political context, it was, you know, it was a tipping point, a boiling point shortly before World War I, when things were starting to develop cracks, and people were feeling that sort of a unity that they had was starting to come apart. So I think it's no coincidence, or maybe it is, that people start to again develop the desire for completeness, for a system with which it would be possible to prove everything. They actually went very far, but then something happened in Vienna, and this is sort of a result of what many of you might know under the name of the Vienna Circle, which happened at Vienna University in the 1910s to 20s. And there was a young mathematician called Kurt Gödel who formulated in a very brief paper this so-called incompleteness theorem, with which he showed that what is really interesting about the whole ambition to create a complete system is that it is impossible to formalize everything, that incompleteness was necessary and inherent for every consistent system to actually become functional and generative. And this is actually taken up 5 years later by a very young guy called Alan Turing in Great Britain, who then reformulates it slightly, only very slightly, and creates the universal Turing machine, which is, as you all know, the computer. So incompleteness is something that I want to sort of propose as something that is very central to the production of knowledge. And I don't know if there's an English expression for it. In German you say Mut zur Lücke. It's something that is, I think, very important, whatever. Of course, I think another question that I'm just posing and not trying to answer is, of course, we have to think what happens in these periods, what happens with art. I mean, if you look at World War I, of course, you can see that the futurists, for example, were the first to run to the front, so to jump into airplanes, and also, I mean, the history of camouflage, for example, is very, very interesting when it comes to it's like the military reaction to Cubism. But let's not talk too much about World War II. So what happens after World War II? After World War II, the computers are actually built. And we have a movement, also sort of a Wiener movement, but by a guy called Norbert Wiener, called cybernetics, which is again the attempt to create a universal system and to create transdisciplinarity. There are huge conferences called the Macy Conferences in the early 50s in New York, where they amass hundreds of people, artists, scientists, biologists, philosophers, and try to breed a new generation of cyberneticians, people who would be versatile in every different context, and who would work with the illusion of a self-regulatory feedback control system that would actually work. So it's a very interesting contemporary thought of the 1950s and 60s, which then, of course, had great repercussions in the development of personal computing and drug culture in the 1960s in California. So this is something where I think utopia and the contemporary start to get superposed in a way. So what we see, or what I've been trying to sketch, is that throughout history there is sort of a prismatic effect. You have always, or maybe it's like a jellyfish, you know, you have always periods of fragmentation, and then you have another period of amalgamation, and then you have analysis and synthesis and universal knowledge and specialized knowledge, large institutions, small cells, museums, galleries, everything like this. And what I was wondering when I was starting to think about this talk last week was if actually the terms contemporary and utopia can still hold as categories to describe the time we are in right now, because I think right now we're in a time that is neither describable by analysis nor synthesis. We live in a time where we have monolithic superpowers and at the same time very fragmented little problems. To put it in the terms of the globalization movement, it's locality. We have big and small at the same time. So utopia is something that is defined by the contemporary as a function of approximation. It's like Zeno's paradox. It's something that can never be reached. Utopia wouldn't be a utopia if it was real. And which of course it's a driving force, it's a motor, it's desire, it's something that we have to reach. And utopia by definition is utopos, which means it's a non-space. It's something where we actually don't want to be, do we? So the question is how we can relate these two terms to each other and if it's actually feasible to do so. But that's a question that I have for you that I can't answer. So I think maybe incompleteness could be something which could be sort of put in there somewhere to sort of make this ocean of knowledge more chartable or more navigable. And to come back to what I started with, which is sort of the progression from esoteric practices to modern science and computing and simulation, I would, to come to an end, like to propose a term, and this is that I think that especially beautiful institutions like TBAs should employ a way of combining pragmatic and magic thinking. So there could be something like pragmagic thinking, and by which it would be possible to be sort of autonomous and embedded at the same time. This is pretty much it. Thank you.